The main character of this story, George, increasingly wondered what he had actually done. Now, looking at everything he had to deal with on a daily basis, he tried to understand how he could have miscalculated so much. He was confident that he would get a completely different result. But in the end, he witnessed the so-called breakthrough. He fought monsters every now and then, trying to summon the girl he loved from her magical shackles. All he wanted with all his soul was to break this vicious connection. And in the end, his wish came true. In the end, he still lost contact with this girl. However, now George was determined to see things through, and he was not willing to give up so easily. He was tormented by thoughts that he had lost his Lena. He tried many ways to get her back, but everything was in vain. He couldn't help but remember his conversations with her and how she sometimes behaved stupidly, assuming that he would one day simply leave her because of what happened to her. Now, alone, George wondered exactly when it all went wrong. He wondered if it had happened at that very unfortunate moment he had been thinking about, or if it had happened even earlier. In fact, George didn't understand who Lena was before him. This was true even before this connection was lost. George hadn't seen how amazing this girl was, unfortunately. Only now did he realize that he had taken her care for granted. He found himself thinking that he had perceived Lena as some kind of hindrance in his life. But in reality, she had become a blessing that had completely changed his life. However, now he realized that with his own hands, he had ruined everything that should have been cherished. But now he assumed that everything had broken a long time ago, on that very day. He remembered how he found Lena for the first time. She was lying in some rundown apartment, and two men were sitting next to her. Then he came and introduced himself as an employee of the Spatial Transition Control Service. There he was met by a man who looked like a devil. When he saw George, he only smirked when he realized that he was both a summoner and a guardian. The thing is that at that time George didn't know something yet. He didn't know what all these incredible events would lead to. However, it was now clear to him that all fateful encounters gave rise to no less fateful consequences. He remembered how he freed the girl from her shackles and carried her out of this apartment, thereby becoming her savior. The strange man, who looked like the devil, continued to try to use some strange spells, but they no longer worked. The girl was saved. The protagonist went over all these events in his head and still could not understand at what exact moment it all began, what ultimately led to such an ending. And now we needed to move into the past of our main character. He worked as a bartender, and it was a completely ordinary day in his bar. It was no different from all the other days. That day, another completely ordinary visitor came to his bar, exactly the same as all the others who came to him. The man entered and calmly said that he had an appointment there. He walked up to the bar and George asked him if he had really come to room number 5. And after thinking for a moment, the red-haired man said that it seemed like he had. The protagonist explained that the door he needed was the 7th door on the right, and that there was a sign with a number on it, so he wouldn't make a mistake, after which he handed him the keys. As George watched the stranger make his way to the right room, he thought about how the day was just beginning. It was only 12 noon, but already 3 booths were occupied. That was what reputation meant. In his opinion, this bar was the best place in the city where they lived. They often played live music here, and people came here to find long-awaited relaxation. However, George also knew that this was the place where the city's elite conducted their affairs, and sometimes something even more sinister happened. Meanwhile, the red-haired man met with his colleague in room number 5, an older man who, at the end of their conversation, suggested that he put everything on paper. Although this place was the best at keeping secrets in the Empire, without George, something like this would simply not have been possible. So as soon as he received the signal, he came to ask if Mr. Christopher needed any help. The man immediately approached him and asked him to testify to the fact that they had voluntarily entered into a deal with this man. Moreover, Christopher told him not to worry, as he would bear all the expenses entirely. As soon as the main character heard all the instructions, he smiled contentedly and said that he was writing all this on his account. He understood that it was not for nothing that he was called the Master of Contracts. However, judging by the red-haired man's face, he was not so pleased with how their meeting ended. But Christopher still behaved calmly. He asked him to simply not pay any attention to it. Meanwhile, George began to cast spells. He called upon magical seals to witness the contract. But he was still curious about what could be so special about this contract. He saw that they paid 10,000 imperial coins for 1 seal, which was quite a lot. But for him it was even better. He also noted the red-haired man Christopher was negotiating with. He looked funny, he was dressed like a nobleman, but at the same time he acted as if he was a servant and had seen magic for the first time. The man was truly frightened when a huge magical seal appeared above their heads, as if he expected some kind of magical beam to burst out of it and attack him. Once everything was ready, George smiled respectfully once again and asked the man to say the words of oath to complete the deal. In fact, he did not care what business they were doing. All that mattered to him was that they paid the money. Christopher spoke first, stating in a perfectly calm voice that he testified that this agreement was made with his consent and without coercion. However, when it was the red-haired man's turn, he suddenly began to tremble and seemed unable to utter a word out of fear. George watched all this with slight bewilderment, but he knew that sometimes there really were gentle clients who were completely unfamiliar with the high art of magic. In the end, the man was finally able to mumble the words that he had testified that this agreement was concluded with his consent and without coercion. He simply repeated Christopher's words, but more timidly. Since all these rituals were unfamiliar to him, he asked Christopher if he needed to do anything else, like sign his name in blood, but he just chuckled and said that they didn't do that. Usually such meetings took place completely calmly and did not require the direct participation of our protagonist. However, in general, George was never against some kind of additional income, especially if it came to him so easily. So when the contract was ready, he turned to Christopher with a smile and asked him if he needed anything else from him. However, the man said that for now he could go, and he would call him later. As the protagonist made his way back to his bar, he reflected on the fact that the main thing was to remember that any attempt to violate agreements concluded in this way had serious consequences. Immediately after him, this unfortunate red-haired man ran out of office number 5, literally shaking with fear and trying to escape from there as quickly as possible. He was so scared that he seemed not to notice the bar counter in front of him and simply flew into it at full speed. He clumsily kicked one of the bar stools, knocking it over, and then began to fall himself, screaming loudly. The next moment he was already lying on the floor upside down, and he had also dropped along with him several glasses that George had been so vigorously cleaning. The waitress, Natalie, who was watching all this, was a little surprised and asked the man if everything was okay with him. However, he didn't answer her. Instead, he simply crawled silently toward the door and somehow reached the handle. George didn't say anything to him either. Instead, he just watched the poor guy go and noted with a smile that he would simply send him a bill for the damaged items by mail. He then returned to his work, noting that the man seemed to have seen the demon himself. But a few gray hairs still wouldn't hurt. But when he looked down under the bar, he realized that room number 5 was sending him a signal again. And although he was unhappy that this man Christopher was calling him to his place again, he was still glad that they were on the same side. When the protagonist arrived there, the man immediately thanked him for helping them, as it was a very important agreement. However, George simply replied that he was always ready to serve his master. In response, Christopher grinned slightly with displeasure and said that in fact, he might not serve him at all. But George still understood that it was not worth buying into it a second time, so he added that serving was disgusting for him, but serving was a different matter. Then he began to think that first this visit had happened, and then this dinner party, and something told him that then they would simply marry him to some woman, and then he would not see any high society, theaters, ballets, or receptions. Meanwhile, Chris opened a bottle of wine and poured himself some, sarcastically asking George who he took after in personality. However, he only threw up his hands and said that, most likely, it was a gift from his relatives. Then the man reminded him with displeasure that George came from an ancient and noble family, but he did not see any pride or honor in him. But George did not like this conversation at all. Christopher continued by saying that money couldn't buy such things. But George was still young, so he didn't understand real values. The protagonist replied that there was no longer any kind of his family. Now he was an ordinary commoner, and he was far from such high noble concepts as family, honor, and pride. And then he asked the man what the great patriarch wanted from the humble bar owner. And he replied that in fact he had one little business that could use his talents. The hero immediately asked whether he was talking about money or a favor. He still didn't understand why such a patriarch from a line of healers needed a dark magician. Christopher replied that he was choosing a favor, and George chuckled in response, asking him what he wanted to pay for. The man noted that he liked the way George had done this office. He wanted the same one in his estate. And now it became clear to the hero what all this talk was about. He noted that this would have required at least 3 days of work, plus travel time. The bar would have needed to be left to someone, and he would have expended a lot of energy, and therefore it would have cost more than one service. But Christopher agreed without further ado, noting that he had no idea how exhausting it was to constantly travel to this city to discuss matters that were not intended for prying ears. George realized that if he really wanted it that much, then in that case he could negotiate, and assumed that Christopher wanted a personal exclusive. The man remarked that it was rare to find such a level of protection, and George was flattered by these words. but he noted that his bank account was not replenished by flattery. So he asked for 50,000 for 2 services, and without further ado, Christopher agreed. At first, the protagonist thought he had sold the order a bit cheaply, but he eventually came to the conclusion that he was the only one who could fulfill such an order, so the patriarch did not argue about the price. He also noted that all the materials would have to be obtained in advance at Christopher's expense. Moreover, some of the ingredients were quite rare and very expensive. But the man said that he already understood perfectly well that everything here was not so simple. Otherwise, he simply would not have started this conversation. George then noted that the issue of his accommodation remained to be resolved, since hotels in the capital and its environs were expensive, and he also needed money for the trip. Apparently, the previously agreed-upon amount would have to be increased. However, Christopher asked George not to test his patience. He said that he provided him with housing in the form of his guest house on his estate. Once all the issues had been resolved, the men were about to say goodbye, and Christopher finally noted that it had been a pleasure dealing with George, but that he had a difficult grip. And then they needed to seal the agreement. And for this, the protagonist prepared another seal on his palm. The thing is, he didn't like contracts on paper. Seals were much more reliable in this regard, since a magical agreement was much more difficult to deceive. When everything was ready, he told Christopher that in the next couple of days he would send a list of materials for the work, noting to himself that in any case, the terms of the contract were always in his favor. After this, the patriarch headed towards the exit of the room and asked the bartender to accompany him to the exit. George obediently went down to the first floor with him, after which he walked the man to the door and wished him a good day. But as soon as the door slammed shut, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. It was still daytime outside, and he was so exhausted. The only thing that made him happy was that, in general, Mondays were pretty quiet. After that, he turned to his partner Michael and asked him to look after the hall for a bit for him. He himself was thinking about how he would leave here, because the bar needed to be audited, and the new suppliers had problems with the documents, and also a band was performing on Tuesday evening. He should have reminded Mike to send out an alert. Natalie had also asked to take a week off, but that would have to be postponed, and all the seals needed to be reviewed and the protection updated. The main character really did have a lot to do, but there was nothing to do. He had to somehow slowly deal with it. He soon arrived at his home and with a snap of his fingers removed all the protective seals that protected his apartment. The first thing he did when he entered his apartment was greet his pet, Serby. Then he thought that 50,000 would be enough for the entry fee to the capital's auction. And living in an aristocrat's estate was quite interesting. This was his first order of this kind. It was even difficult for him to evaluate it, and he didn't like it when things turned out this way. 2 services from a healer were required, and another 50,000 on top, and George couldn't shake the thought that he had sold it too cheaply. Meanwhile, Christopher was already driving in his car and was about 15 minutes away from the city where George lived. His driver suddenly decided to express his opinion and noted that he didn't really like the guy very much. Christopher immediately realized that he was talking about George. The driver then said that he thought the guy was too brazen to be a commoner. But his boss still asked him not to be so hasty, because a tree was judged by its fruits, and a man by his deeds. With such talent, he could do anything. And if things had turned out differently, he might have already become a master, if his family had not disowned him. However, Christopher still did not lose hope. He told his driver Alex that in any case, everything would soon fall into place. A week has passed since that conversation, and during this time, all of the main character's pressing affairs have practically been completed. He kept wondering if he had managed to do everything, and he also kept wondering why Christopher needed this room. But his pet Serby began to get irritated by his constant walking around the room. The protagonist assumed that his instincts had taken over, and the animal did not deny it. It threatened the hero that it would simply burn him. Finally, George stopped pacing and said he had a funny feeling as if he had forgotten something, and he really didn't want to leave. However, he couldn't do this because he had already made a contract, and otherwise they would simply be left without money, and 50,000 weren't lying around on the road. Previously, he had gone to the city without complaining about anything, but now he felt that there was some kind of second bottom here, but so far he could not figure out what it was. Seeing Serby's displeased face, George reminded him that it was he who had thrust it into the hands of the very young dark mage when his first summoning had been unstable. However, the little animal continued to frown and said that if it weren't for him, he would have simply been eaten by those who were stronger. This story took place about 10 years ago, in an abandoned hangar in an unknown location. After long hours of preparation and mountains of burned paper, this was the protagonist's first attempt to understand his new magic, as no instructions were left for him. As a result, his theoretical research turned into practical work, and to his great surprise, nothing even exploded. Eventually, with the help of his magic, he was able to summon a creature that looked like a huge wolf or dog. George was extremely surprised that he managed to summon someone on the first try, and so successfully. As soon as the creature came out to him, it did not show any aggression, and the main character was even able to stroke it on the head. However, now this creature, namely Serby, looked completely different. Now he was no longer that ferocious wolf, but looked more like a decorative fluffy dog. George would never have thought that his first summon would turn out to be his faithful companion. Serby was the strongest and most capable of all his summons. However, now he made a rather sad decision for Serby. Namely, he decided to take him with him, and the pet did not like it at all. He wanted to stay here alone. He offered George to take Sword instead, and he said that this was not a bad idea, but Serby would still go with him, since, surprisingly, this pet sometimes gave very good advice. He understood that the sword was actually much more useful on the journey than Serby, but the little animal had become very lazy lately anyway, so he needed at least some kind of shake-up. He told Serby that Christopher's estate had a lot of delicacies, much more than theirs, so he just needed to put on a cute face and act calm. Serby still didn't like the idea very much, since he was a demon and a hunter, but now they put some stupid collar on him, which, on top of everything else, also made him look fat. After that, when the preparations were finally finished, they began to descend. George was a little nervous because this was the first time he had left the bar unsupervised. Now his partner Michael was in charge. However, he was still glad that he had people he could rely on, including his waitress, Natalie. He understood that having no one in this life was a terrible fate, which was much worse than death. Once everything was finished, he headed towards the exit with his pet, saying goodbye to his workers. He headed to the garage, realizing that he still felt uneasy. He still couldn't understand how Michael and Natalie would cope without him. As it turned out, George never liked trains or planes, but when it came to motorcycles, it was a completely different matter, especially if he had the spirit of a fiery horse within him. The protagonist realized that he hadn't used his beloved motorcycle for a long time, but he promised his iron horse to make up for all those missed rides. However, Serby did not like the idea at all that his owner was going to ride a motorcycle all the way to the capital. However, George calmed him down. He said that everything would be fine, since this guy was essentially his fellow countryman, so Serby shouldn't panic. However, the little animal still stood its ground. He said that he would never sit there, and even began to be afraid, trying to threaten and remind the owner that he was, after all, a powerful demon. But this was no argument for George. He picked up Serby and asked him to stop whining. After all, they weren't going to the vet. Serby continued to scream, as he was clearly unhappy with the fact that he was simply put in some kind of travel bag. He promised to pay back for this humiliation. Until the very end, the little animal hoped that George would come to his senses and not do this. But the next moment his head was already being pressed down by the lid of the carrier. However, the main character asked him not to dramatize it, since it was just a carrier for animals. When everything was ready, he looked at his motorcycle again, and remembered that there was once a time when it just appeared, and making the motorcycle obsessed became an interesting and challenging task. Now his Harley-Davidson had autopilot, climate control, and a firewheel effect, and it no longer even needed gas. The protagonist admitted that he was no longer stopped every kilometer along the road, as was the case at first, but now all the locals had gotten used to him. He couldn't help but admit that this motorcycle was one of his best works, especially when its wheels were covered in flames. When everything was ready, he activated his possessed motorcycle, summoned a fiery horse, and then set off on his way. The protagonist noted that perhaps it was possible to run away from fate, but ironically, as usually happened, he was rushing straight towards it. George spent 4.5 hours on the road, and soon arrived at Christopher's estate, noting that the advantages of animated technology were simply undeniable. When he arrived at the right place, he was already met by 2 guards, and George immediately noted that this patriarch had settled in quite well. However, the men immediately stopped him and said that he could not go any further. Moreover, they did not know who he was or why he had come. Then the main character took off his helmet, said his name, and said that Christopher had invited him, but one of the guards asked him to step aside. George was unpleasantly surprised and began to feel as if Christopher had not been aware of his visit at all, or perhaps he had simply forgotten about it. Serby, on the other hand, was glad that they had finally stopped, and now he could get out of this confinement and walk around a bit, since he was already tired of sitting in one position. And George kept thinking about the fact that it seemed as if the servants were expecting some important guest, but it was unclear who this guest was, and if they were not talking about George himself. At that moment, a car drove past him and was allowed through the estate gates without any questions. George immediately noted that there were no coats of arms on the car, and most likely this was intended for encryption. This whole situation was starting to really annoy him, since Christopher himself had called him and now simply wouldn't let him inside. However, the gates were already open anyway, so he considered the possibility of simply slipping inside, thinking that Christopher would forgive him this little prank. So, without thinking twice, the main character started his motorcycle again, deciding to simply add a little gas. The wheels of his motorcycle were on fire again. The fiery horse was ready to rush at full speed again. In just one instant, the main character had already caught up with the car in which that very important guest was located, and suddenly those same guards appeared in front of him again and blocked his way, saying that this was private territory. George did not understand how they got there. It was like some kind of witchcraft. Then he finally decided to explain himself and said that Christopher had invited him to do some important work, and perhaps he was already furious because he was late. When the guards heard this, they asked something through their headphones, and finally, after 20 minutes of waiting or lazy whispering, they apologized to George for the delay and said that he would now be shown to the guest quarters. As soon as the main character entered the gates of the mansion, he was immediately met by a girl in formal attire and with a folder in her hands. She immediately bowed to the guest and said that her name was Anna. She was supposed to accompany George to the mansion. At first, the protagonist noted that this maid was quite small, but suddenly he felt something strange, like some kind of bad premonition. When he returned, he saw that his pet Serby had dug a huge hole somewhere in the yard. As it turned out, he had dug up some strange wires, and apparently was very pleased with his find. However, George hastened to pick him up, saying that good dogs should not chew on power lines, and that Serby should not forget their agreement. Then he returned to Anna again and apologized, saying that his pet had run away, and the girl was very happy to see the cute little animal. George thought it was a good thing he had caught him in time, just a little bit more, and everyone would have realized that Serby was a demon. If Christopher had found out that George was actually a summoner, there would have been consequences he didn't even want to think about. Soon after, Anna took him to the guest house that had been set aside especially for him. It was rather modest by their standards, but for George it was a whole mansion. Anna also asked him not to leave the house, and that he could rest until the evening, since Christopher could not receive him now. When they entered the guest quarters, the protagonist was very surprised that such a luxurious place was intended for guests. Everything was too luxurious and unusual for him, but Anna ignored this remark and asked the man if he needed anything else. But as George did not want anything, she headed for the door, saying that Christopher would receive him in the evening, and in the meantime he could rest. As soon as she left, Serby began asking the owner why they couldn't live in similar conditions, since as far as he knew, George was quite rich. However, the main character said that in reality, he could have lived something like this, but he didn't want it. His modest home was much more familiar to him. He started casting spells immediately after that, as safety was paramount, even though Serby didn't like it. George used lower spells. They were ideal for protection and required little energy. If another magician had seen him now from the side, he would have laughed, because George worked with his hands. As 400 years ago, now it was customary to do it with the power of thought. But be that as it may, he was many times better than all these magicians. If it weren't for the conditions written in the seal, these creatures would have done a lot of damage. And now George was wondering which of these magicians could survive an encounter with at least one of these creatures that he had managed to contain. As soon as everything was ready and all the seals were activated, the protagonist suddenly felt very tired. But now that he was out of danger, he realized he could take the time to take a nap. In this place they felt quite good and calm, and he felt as if his eyes were closing on their own. However, when he found himself in a dream, he realized that he had ended up in some terrible place. He was chained by his hands and feet to some stone slab. When George began to look around, he realized that he was surrounded by terrifying demons who wanted to kill him. The next moment he saw in front of him a man dressed as a doctor, who raised a sharp dagger over his head and prepared to strike the main character. The blow landed right on George's shoulder, causing him to feel incredible pain, but the strange doctor continued to laugh. George woke up immediately from such a terrible dream. He grabbed the place where the strange man from his dream hit him, and wondered why he dreamed something like that again. He hadn't dreamed about this for a long time, and he already thought that he had gotten rid of this nightmare, but these horrors still did not leave him. However, a sound brought the protagonist out of his thoughts. He did not understand who could have come to him at such an hour. However, he still got up from the sofa, and without even buttoning his shirt, headed to the door to see who had come to see him. When he opened the door, he saw a blushing Anna, who clearly did not expect to meet George looking like that. The girl timidly looked away, after which she turned to the man again and said that Christopher was ready to accept him. Suddenly, curiosity got the better of her, and Anna stood up on tiptoe a little to look behind the main character and see what was in his room. But he stopped her, not allowing her to look deeper. After that, he silently turned around and headed back to his guest house, leaving the girl dissatisfied. After a while, he went to Christopher, who looked dissatisfied. He explained that he did not like to use magic where it was not needed. This was one of the healing dogmas. However, he still did not want to talk about it now, since it was all a daily problem, and he also asked George not to hold a grudge against his servants. At this moment, the main character noticed the papers that were lying on the man's desk. Meanwhile, he took a bottle of wine and said that he had asked his assistant not to let anyone in, which was why he had taken up the work so eagerly. He then handed the protagonist a bottle of expensive wine and offered to drink it as an apology for this misunderstanding. For a moment, George froze, not even wanting to think about how much that bottle of wine had cost. Christopher then added with a smile that his opinion as an expert was that a little wine at night was even beneficial. Soon after, he poured it into 2 glasses for himself and his guest. George said that he actually preferred cognac, but he did not refuse this wine either. However, Christopher told him that he should still inform him that he had decided to come to see him. But the main character explained this by saying that he thought that the faster he completed the order, the better it would be, so he came so spontaneously. This explanation suited Christopher perfectly, so he didn't ask any unnecessary questions. But he still added that George was not the only person today who decided to suddenly drop in on him. Then the hero asked him with a smile who had made him so happy. Christopher explained that it was his niece. She was tired of sitting at the academy, so she decided to suddenly run away from there and come to her beloved uncle. George noted that his niece had been allowed inside without question, but he decided not to pursue the matter further, and asked Christopher when he should start work. But the man said that he was acting too formally. He should have felt at home. First, he needed to rest for at least a day, and take a little walk around the estate. But when he realized that George was adamant, he said that all the materials had already been delivered, so he could start tomorrow, and then asked if he needed any additional tools. But the hero replied that he had all the necessary tools, after which he finally took a sip of this expensive wine. After this, he rose from his seat, said that he would not detain Christopher any longer, and asked to be allowed to leave. But the man asked him to at least look at the pond that his late wife had taken care of. You wouldn't see anything like that in the city. The man thought to himself that if the two got along, it would only be better for everyone, since George would receive protection from his family, and Aaron would be settled. But he decided that it was too early to think about it. Following the man's advice, the protagonist actually went to the pond, sat down in the gazebo, and thought about what a crazy day it had been. But at least no one had talked about entering the academy. He didn't understand what he could do there among all those rich kids, since he was quite good in his own right. Then George used magic and suddenly found a small fairy in his palms. With each passing second, the fairy grew larger and larger, and at some point she broke free from the protagonist's hands. She flew into the air in front of George and began to dance against the backdrop of Christopher's beautiful mansion. At that moment, a woman appeared right behind him. She said that it was very beautiful, but George replied that it was just a prank. The woman said that she had never seen anything like it. Because it was a living creature, she felt it. But the hero said that it was not quite like that. It was just a semi-material shell. However, when the girl began to question him, he realized that he had said this in vain. He had to explain that it was the result of a spell, but he did not say which one. The woman said she loved revealing secrets, but George just laughed it off, wishing her luck in the endeavor. She then said that she hadn't seen him there before and thought he was a new employee, and the protagonist also assumed that she worked there. And then the girl finally introduced herself. She was the niece of the owner of the estate. Her name was Erin. The protagonist was not very impressed, but nevertheless greeted the young lady herself, who appeared to him in person. Erin explained that she had interned at the Royal School of Art in England, where it was cold, foggy, and everyone was obsessed with pedigrees, so she decided that homeschooling would be better than academic education. George joked that she was clearly asked to leave so that she wouldn't embarrass the others, and the girl didn't deny it. She said that they simply couldn't stand it. She added that they did not usually allow servants to lecture, and since she had not seen George at the academy, she assumed that he was just a servant. Then, when she learned his name, she said that she had not heard of such a thing, and asked what family he belonged to which the hero replied that he was an ordinary commoner. But Erin didn't believe him, since such a powerful magician had to belong to some kind of family. and George didn't look like an ordinary guest at all. The main character only replied with a smile that he was ready to admit that he was a thief, that he broke into other people's estates and stole pretty girls. Aaron thought that in that case, she should have called the guards right now so they could use the arm-wringing technique and a couple of attack spells. Then the hero finally decided to give in. He said that in fact Christopher had hired him. But there was one problem. He had a direct contract with the employer, which meant that he was not obliged to obey Aaron. But the girl said that he was nevertheless obliged to show the same performance to her personally once again. He didn't understand why she asked him about this and why she needed it. The girl turned away and said that he didn't have to be her uncle either, but the hero still stood his ground and declared that he was going to listen only to him. These words really angered Aaron, and she said that they would see who would listen to whom. After that, she headed towards the mansion with displeasure, leaving the protagonist to sit alone in the gazebo, thinking that this girl was too much for his secrets. Soon after that, he returned to his room. Serby told him that today he touched the security thread, and when everyone came running, he simply barked. The faces of the guards at that moment were worth seeing. George said he was lucky because everyone knew Serby was with him. Otherwise, they would have simply killed him. The little animal then asked him why he had shown the call in front of the stranger, to which George replied that he knew what he was doing. And in any case, the woman did not understand anything. Then Serby asked him with a smile if he was really going to cover this female, but George immediately denied this, saying that they were as different as a bicycle and an apple. The little animal did not understand this comparison, and then the hero explained that it simply meant that they were completely different people. And even though he didn't like all this talk, he couldn't help but notice that Aaron was a girl with character, and that was exactly what he liked. Meanwhile, someone was persistently knocking on his door, and the main character still could not understand why someone wanted to see him so much. When he approached the door, he saw that Anna was standing behind it, who, apparently, had been waiting for him for a very long time and was already dissatisfied. She said that she had been waiting for him for an hour, and he had arbitrarily put protection on the house. George apologized for this, saying that Christopher had not told him anything about an escort. The girl explained that George was currently their guest, and their job was to take care of guests. The protagonist understood that he didn't like it, and told the girl that in that case, she could be free. The thing is, he didn't need an escort. He advised that it would be better to order all the working materials to be sent to him directly to his office. That would be useful. Anna, apparently, was simply stunned by this request, since she clearly did not expect that her accompaniment would be so easily refused. George was only thinking about how to get rid of her as quickly as possible and said that everything was fine. She could consider it a little holiday. Then he suddenly smiled and said that perhaps she had come here not only to accompany him, and then added that he was very fond of girls with violet eyes. When Anna heard this, she became furious and immediately moved away from the main character. Soon after that, they went their separate ways, but Anna kept glancing at him. When George was left alone, he couldn't help but think that this girl was very intrusive. He suggested that she could be a spy, but he quickly discarded these thoughts. Then he came to the office where his materials were supposed to be. He suddenly realized that the door there was closed. However, it was no problem for him. He simply used his magic seal skill to open the lock. But when the main character entered inside, he realized that there was absolutely nothing interesting here. All the things, except for a few pieces of furniture, were simply hidden. He then walked over to the table where his things were supposed to be and found several dark green bags there. Inside was a finely ground Australian opal and middle mist petals, and George began to wonder who Christopher was using to buy all these things. However, he still decided not to think about such things and just get to work. He looked into the drawer in the hope that at least some paper had been left there, and he was lucky. There were several stacks of blank sheets. Now George thought about how to place them. He wanted to put one in the bookcase and one on the chandelier, but this was not enough. At least 2 pieces needed to be put in the bookcase. The summoning radius was limited to just 1 office, so George decided that 5 points would be enough. For Christopher's office, he used the same principle as in his bar, only instead of anchors, he used rare herbs and minerals. Whoever was within these walls would no longer be able to lie or harm the owner, or harbor dark thoughts. If even one of these rules were broken, the violator would experience the most excruciating pain in the world, which nothing could relieve. When everything was ready, the protagonist was ready to begin the spell that would put protection on this office. In fact, he was thinking that perhaps it was wrong to solve things this way and go against human morality. However, this was none of his business, since he was a dark magician, and this was his job. And what the consequences were did not concern him at all. Soon, several spheres appeared from the seals he drew on the sheets. They began to circle around him as George cast the spell. The most interesting thing was that if someone tried to unravel the secret of these spheres, their essence would immediately break, and at that very moment the contract would end. This was created on the initiative of the main character himself, since he really did not like it when someone poked their nose into his secrets. After a while, everything was ready. It was only 5 p.m., and George had already finished. Now all that was left was to observe how the seal worked, and it was time to go home. After that, without further thought, he headed towards the exit of the room. But what happened when he opened the door was unexpected for him. As soon as he opened the door, he immediately went to the stairs, and there he ran into Anna, whom he did not notice because he was in the clouds. The girl also started screaming for him to let her go, but George only politely supported her and said that Christopher's family were healers, and in the end there wouldn't be a scratch on them, but it would be very painful. Then he finally stopped joking and said that he didn't care, but asked Anna not to run around like that anymore. And then she said that she was actually looking for him. She explained that she had not given him the keys to the office that morning, but George said that she need not have bothered, since the office was unlocked. The girl didn't understand why he was saying that, since the office should definitely have been locked. But the hero pretended not to understand anything, and simply thanked the girl for worrying about him. 2 hours later, George found himself somewhere on the outskirts of the capital, in a fashionable and indecently expensive place, where Aaron gave him a tour and told him about the kind of people who belonged to wealthy families. Now the hero had only 2 questions: what he was wasting his life on, and what he was doing here. And also one more: he was interested in how he got here in the first place. The thing is, not long before this, Aaron came to him and began to persuade him. She said that she needed an escort, and her uncle would be very unhappy if she went alone. In the end, the main character finally agreed, and the girl considered her bet settled. In the end, he finally listened to her, even though he said he wouldn't do it. George didn't answer her, but he kept reproaching himself for being so weak towards pretty girls like her. However, he was distracted from his thoughts by Aaron's voice, who noticed that he had not been listening to her at all, but suddenly she saw someone familiar. A blonde man approached them. Aaron explained his name was Oliver. He was a good friend of hers and the organizer of the race, so she introduced them to George. The men shook hands, but it couldn't be said that they were particularly pleased to meet each other. Oliver managed to smile and said he was very glad to see new faces here. George had no idea why he was trying to appear friendly, but he still reciprocated. Then Aaron asked her friend with a smile what fun thing was waiting for them that evening. Oliver said they had something special today. It was a little friendly competition. After this, he took the girl with him and said that some of their friends had decided to risk their toys, and one of the participants was so confident in himself that he even offered his car as a prize. At this point, George was left standing alone, the whole atmosphere completely uninteresting to him. When they went outside, they saw several sports cars in the parking lot. Oliver said that the mayor of the city is a close relative of one of their younger families, so he kindly agreed to free up a couple of streets for them for one run. Then the main character asked him with a grin if he wasn't afraid that he would end up on the front pages of all the newspapers tomorrow. But Oliver did not succumb to the provocation, and simply addressed the hero as a person who rarely attended such events. Perhaps this was something new for him, but such meetings were usually closed. Suddenly Aaron noticed someone ahead and asked Oliver who it was. Oliver looked at the man in the helmet and said that it was their black horse, the 6th participant who showed up at the very end of registration. George was surprised that there were only 6 participants in the end, since there were only 5 cars in front of them. And then Oliver said that this was the most interesting thing. The thing is that this guy decided to participate not on a sports car, but on his motorcycle. However, the protagonist did not understand what the problem was, because it seemed to him that it was completely against the rules. But Oliver explained that if the other participants agreed with it, then the others didn't see any problem with it either. What was actually funny was that, despite the fact that this participant was on a motorcycle against the Manga cars, none of the observers even bet on him. As soon as the hero heard about the bets, he immediately became interested and asked if there really was a bookmaker there. Then Oliver pointed out one guy in the posts, saying that he was the one responsible for all the bets. The protagonist headed towards that guy, leaving Aaron and Oliver alone. He approached the blonde man in the red t-shirt and said he wanted to place a bet, but the man began to doubt he had enough money for it. Since he was accepting a card transfer, George decided to bet 3,000 on the motorcyclist, learning that he had odds of 50 to 1. Soon after the race began, the protagonist returned to Aaron, and together they watched the competition. In fact, the race was quite good, and the prize was quite good. By that time, 5 cars and 1 motorcyclist had already gathered at the launch site, and numerous drones were filming the entire event. George thought that if he had known that the prize for first place was a Magokar, he would have also participated on his fiery horse and even bet on his victory. Literally, a few moments later the race began, and the cars and motorcycle immediately took off. Suddenly, the main character snatched the tablet from the hands of one of the spectators and opened the list of participants. He clicked on the part of the broadcast that was specifically following the motorcyclist. This way he could see the race straight from his face. Meanwhile, the sixth participant accelerated his motorcycle to its maximum speed in order to overtake the other cars. It seemed as if his wheels were leaving lightning-fast marks, so fast he was driving. Soon he caught up with one of the cars and was ready to overtake it. But suddenly the driver of the orange car abruptly swerved, thereby blocking the motorcyclist's passage. The participant frowned slightly, and judging by the gleam in his eyes, he was not ready to let such an act slide. Instead of stopping, he accelerated sharply and used the car that blocked his path as a springboard to fly through the air over it. The car was simply thrown up and flew backwards with a huge roar. Thus, one of the participants had already dropped out, and the rest continued moving. Soon the motorcyclist overtook two more cars and, moreover, caused them to collide with each other. He still had two opponents left, and soon he caught up with another car. Both participants did not want to give in to each other. But the motorcyclist turned out to be more agile. He skillfully overtook one car, then another, and pulled ahead. Now he was in second place. In a matter of moments, he caught up with the last car, which essentially remained his only rival. But it was not difficult for him to overtake her. And this time the participant did not resist at all, unlike all the others. This made the sixth participant a little surprised. He even looked back to see if this participant was not going to do anything. However, when he realized that everything was calm, he finally reached the finish line and soon got off his motorcycle. When the sixth participant took off his mask, Erin was taken aback. She realized that it was none other than Alex, but she thought that he lived as a hermit. The main character himself knew that Alex had two adult daughters, and his eldest son was about 10 years old. But overall, he didn't care who the guy was. The main thing for him was that he earned him some money. At this moment, the sixth participant noticed two young people, namely Erin and George, and immediately greeted them. He approached them, extended his hand to the protagonist, and introduced himself with his full name. Seeing the girl's displeased look, he repeated his name again so that she could hear it better. Alex heard that the main character's bet was the only one, and he said that this was indeed true. He thought that Alex had the best chance. The man was sincerely grateful to George for believing in him, but asked him to excuse him, as he still had some things to do and needed to go urgently. As a result, the main character earned 150,000 in 5 minutes, which was pretty good. He even started thinking about ordering a suit that could withstand both swords and magic, and one studio that made such suits was just nearby. But suddenly he noticed Erin, who was standing with her eyes averted somewhere to the side. Apparently, she was unhappy about something. However, the protagonist's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. He suggested that she return home as soon as possible. The girl did not refuse and took the guy by the hand, after which they headed back to Christopher's mansion. Back there, George thought that it was a good idea to come here. He definitely didn't go wrong. He was able to get a lot of money here and ended up ordering the very suit he wanted. But since it was already deep night outside, he really wanted to sleep. So he yawned loudly. Right at that moment, Anna came out of the next corridor and noticed George, who had returned home too late. She didn't even suspect that the pendant on her neck was already under the power of the main character, who had placed a seal on it and could now command the girl. He used his magic to take her aside. The girl was as if enchanted and did not notice anything around her. She was like a puppet controlled by someone from above, so she immediately turned around and walked in the opposite direction from George. He was very pleased with how everything turned out. Besides everything else, he was able to get rid of this clingy girl and decided to remember this good method for the next time. Soon after, he went to his office, which he had recently sealed, and there was an oppressive silence. The main character immediately reached for the bags of magic spheres that he had hidden in one of the cabinets last time. He took out one sphere and carefully wiped it with a handkerchief. It sparkled incredibly brightly, and the hero noted that it was even better than he had imagined. After that, he used magic on it, and the sphere rose into the air, illuminating the entire room with its bright light. With each passing second, she began to glow brighter and brighter, as if she was getting ready to release something from herself. A moment later, a small pink fairy appeared in the protagonist's palm, similar to the one he had summoned earlier. The fairy soon came to her senses and finally spread her wings, flying out of the sphere and looking at the main character. However, with one movement of his hand, he removed her and the sphere somewhere to another part of the room. When he was alone, he thought about how his grandfather had been studying the possibility of such a summons all his life. However, It was George who became the lucky one who tested his theories on his own skin. And now, looking at the skills he already possessed, he realized that he had greatly surpassed everyone in his family. He was very lucky then, since elementally summoned creatures were not able to exist for more than a couple of seconds. But in his case, everything was different. He remembered those terrible moments he had experienced as a child. He remembered those terrifying hands of monsters that reached out to him. The fact is that his elder clan simply abandoned him, because in their eyes he was nobody. He was just a weak secret, incapable of any accomplishments. In the end, his own family gave him a condition. Either he gave them his grandfather's work, or he got out of the house. However, his family miscalculated. None of them guessed that George would become exactly what he became. To survive, he had to figure it all out himself. As a result, he left home and was forced to wander through abandoned buildings, studying his grandfather's developments there in order to try to apply them in practice himself. As it turned out, the main character became the owner of a very rare gift. He was able to tear apart the space between worlds and summon a creature into this world. Several years of research led him to some pretty good results. The protagonist learned to control his summons, and was even able to use them for his own purposes. Thus the creatures simply became his servants. Naturally, he was looking for such creatures for his own personal use. And eventually, a couple of years ago, this search was crowned with success for him. The thing is, the summoner turned out to be a homeless old man, and due to his age, he was unable to use his powers, and as a result, his own family threw him out into the street. But the main character still found him. The old man told him his story. And from his story, George realized that their abilities were different. Normal summoners seemed to rip the creature from its home world and feed it with their magic for the duration of the summoning. But his summons were able to exist freely, absorbing the energy of their world as if it were their own. However, he remembered the fateful day when the old man suddenly went crazy and started shouting something about a dark summoner. At some point, he became so distraught that he simply ran out onto the roadway and was hit by cars. His behavior changed in an instant. The main character didn't even have time to do anything when he ran out onto the highway and met his end there. But now he was back in the real world. Now everything in the room was ready. He had completed his task with flying colors. However, he decided not to tell Christopher yet that the work was finished. He wanted to watch this room for a couple more days, and during this time his magic suit had just been brought to him. Meanwhile, the story moved to the city's port. It was getting on for the evening, and one of the workers' wives started texting him asking where he was. And the man simply said that he was running late, but he was already getting ready to go home. But at that moment he suddenly heard some strange sound coming from somewhere in the water not far from him. At first the worker didn't pay any attention to it. He thought it was just his partner who dropped something into the water. But when his partner didn't call him, the man began looking around and realized that something strange was making noise behind him. He was seriously scared and immediately rushed forward, still not understanding who could be making such strange sounds. When he reached the end of the port, he suddenly stopped and began to look from side to side, trying to find the source of the sound with his eyes. Literally the next moment, a huge creature appeared in front of him. It was a monster that looked more like a fish than a man, and it was also twice as tall as the man himself. Out of fear, the port worker dropped his phone and his hat flew off his head. He turned sharply and ran in the opposite direction. But it was no trouble for the huge monster to catch up with him. With one sharp leap, he jumped right to the place where the unfortunate man was supposed to run. Before the worker could do anything, the monster was already right in front of him, grabbed him with its huge paws and bit into his neck, tearing off a piece of his flesh. Meanwhile, his phone was still lying on the ground, now covered in his own blood. When the worker was finished, the monster simply returned back to its watery abode, dragging all the evidence with it. 2 days had passed since then. The protagonist was able to observe the seal he had placed on the room, and was now ready to report the results to Christopher. The man was very pleased and noted that he had always been amazed by George's abilities. He did not deny the praise, and said that he really did have some skills. Then Christopher invited him to sit at the table and showed him some papers. As far as the man remembered, George was self-taught. However, when they sat down opposite each other, the protagonist understood from the man's look that exactly what he didn't like was about to begin. So he looked away with displeasure and said that Christopher knew it very well himself. The man didn't respond to this. He just continued to stare intently at his assistant. Then he asked him if George had thought about going to the academy. However, the hero said that no one needed him there, since commoners like him could not study at such an elite institution. But Christopher persisted, saying that if George saw it that way, then maybe he should have gotten a grant, or at worst, just paid for his education. But George didn't like these options. He would either have a grant that would bind him to give up his work, or he would simply give away all his money. So he decided it would be better to just take care of his own training. Then Christopher asked him with a grin how much the secret to creating this room they were in right now cost. But George just shrugged and said he was afraid that even he couldn't afford such expenses. At that moment, Christopher's face suddenly became serious. He said that perhaps he could repay with the services that the protagonist adored so much. But George only said that in that case, not only Christopher himself, but his entire city would be indebted to him. Such was the enormous price for it. The man didn't argue with him, but he still caught the protagonist thinking that deep down, he knew Christopher was right. George immediately began to make excuses. He said that he would never want to waste his precious time sitting at a desk with children from aristocratic families. He also noted that Christopher had brought up this conversation year after year, but his answer never changed, so he didn't understand why it was necessary to do it. The man told him that George was capable of much more, but now he decided not to talk about it. He only said that the agreed amount had already been transferred to his account, as well as the 2 promised services. Then the hero noted that there should be 4 services if you count them together with the rest. In response, Christopher smiled and asked him if he had really decided to collect favors. To this, the main character seriously replied that money has the property of depreciating. A favor, especially from an aristocrat, was a currency immune to inflation, and Christopher had nothing to fear, since he was not asking anything of him that would go beyond what was acceptable. Christopher didn't seem to like this answer very much, so he frowned with displeasure. The protagonist caught this look and turned away, pretending that he had not said anything. Christopher continued, noting that while someone like him might keep their end of the bargain, there are also people who simply go back on their word. George didn't really like where this conversation was going, so he flinched and looked at the man in surprise. Christopher still looked unperturbed, and asked what the protagonist would do with such people if he came across them. George just smiled sweetly and said he wouldn't do anything about it. This answer left Christopher stunned, and he was silent for a moment, not knowing what to say. The protagonist explained that if he did run into such people, they would definitely regret their decision. Christopher asked what made George the way he was, but the hero did not answer, since his work here was already completed, and he did not want to delay either himself or the man. Christopher finally stood up and insisted that they would return to this conversation later. George didn't answer, instead heading for the door, waving goodbye to the man, and leaving the room. He walked down the hallway back to his guest house, thinking about everything that had happened over the past few days. Serby was already waiting for him at the threshold of his house, clearly unhappy that his owner had been absent for such a long time. The main character only said that Serby understands absolutely nothing about human society and the rules of decency. Serby was offended by these words and headed back to the room with displeasure, noting that if George found out how things were with the demons, he simply wouldn't be able to sleep afterwards. George didn't argue with him and said that he took his word for it. At that moment, Aaron appeared and asked if George really could talk to animals. He noted to himself that the girl had a talent for arriving at the wrong time. However, she looked dazzling, wearing a chic purple dress and jewelry that matched it, so George decided not to upset her. He offered her to take his hand, and explained that the animal was actually much smarter than it seemed, after which he addressed Aaron by name. The girl explained that addressing each other by name was not unusual, since they had already agreed to address each other without formality. However, she didn't like George's behavior, so instead of taking his hand, she headed in the other direction. She reached George's room and opened the large wooden door slightly, inviting him to follow her. George didn't argue and followed Aaron, thinking to himself that he had done the right thing in getting rid of all the demons in time. At this point, Serby sat down on the arm of the sofa and playfully asked if George had finished his work and was coming back. George calmly noted that he was indeed returning to his city, since everyone in his bar had already missed him. Aaron then asked him if he liked places like that. George said he liked them, and that on a gloomy evening in this city there was nothing better than a glass of cognac and a heart-to-heart talk with the bartender. However, Aaron didn't seem impressed by this answer. George tried to justify himself, noting that he was only joking, but the girl's expression showed that she was still not convinced by his words. Then he decided to lay all his cards on the table and announced that he really did own the bar, and that Christopher really loved to go there. But Aaron still had doubts in her soul. She had no idea that his uncles could have interesting establishments like this. George just chuckled and noted that he actually had a very interesting place there, and then asked if she had come to say goodbye or if she had some other purpose. Aaron lounged on the couch, grinned coquettishly, and noted that she just wanted to talk. Then she slowly began to straighten her dress and began to approach George. He thought that the girl had decided to play the seductress, but he was in a good mood, so he decided to play along and gently took Aaron by the face. He placed both palms on her cheeks and moved closer to her face. His thumb slid across her lips and she didn't seem to mind. George pulled back sharply and noted to himself that the girl might not understand that all these secrets would one day consume her. Then he thought that for Aaron this was a game, but for him it was real life, and decided that she better find another test subject to practice her skills. Aaron was extremely indignant, as she was not used to being refused. George calmly said that he didn't want to spoil his relationship with her uncle, and Aaron shouldn't test his patience. However, the girl was not convinced, as she still did not understand what a man like him was capable of. George came up and gently poked her in the nose with his finger, explaining that being of noble birth may not always help. The girl was furious at such impudent behavior, but she understood that she could not say anything in response to him. George did not want to continue the pointless argument and asked her to calm down. Aaron didn't even answer, but quickly headed for the exit, slammed the door loudly, and left George alone. As soon as he had collected his things, he headed to the garage, where his favorite motorcycle, on which Serby was sleeping, was already waiting. While Serby was dreaming sweet dreams about treats, George was wondering how the little animal managed to handle everything on his short legs. Then he gently stroked the motorcycle, which understood him without words. He mounted his motorcycle and headed towards the gate, guarded by 2 security guards he had met on previous visits. One of the guards asked if George had really decided to leave them for the night. The hero said that he had indeed decided not to linger, but he wondered to himself whether the man was happy that he was leaving, or whether Christopher himself had had a hand in it. As he drove out of the gates of the mansion, he thought that at that moment it seemed to him that all his adventures would end there, and he would be able to return to his normal rhythm of life. As he drove through the city, he thought about how much he loved driving at night, because here you can be truly free. There was an endless stretch of road that was soothing, the roar of the engine, the wind blowing in his face, and George could have driven like this forever. A week at Christopher's estate had completely turned him into a lazybones, but if you think about it, it was his first holiday in 3 years, and he might not get the chance to go on a ride like that again. So he decided that if he arrived at the bar a couple of hours later, nothing bad would happen. But while he was driving along the road, he suddenly felt a strange sensation. The protagonist abruptly took off his helmet because he felt that something was wrong here, as if something strange was happening somewhere nearby. Serby was puzzled as to why they had stopped abruptly. He could not see anything from his carrier, and could only navigate by the words of his owner. At that moment, George turned to him and asked if the little animal really didn't feel anything itself. At that moment, they both listened a little to the sounds and sensations. Serby assumed that someone was simply dabbling in magic nearby, since there could still be gifted people among the people they observed, and there was nothing strange about it. However, the hero noted that there weren't many people among them who could summon demons, and that was exactly what he felt at the moment. However, Serby suggested that he leave things as they were, since this guy would die anyway, even if he tried to summon demons. He didn't want his master to get into any trouble again, but the protagonist couldn't just leave this place. Judging by the energy he saw right in front of him, it was another commoner who considered himself a diamond in the rough and decided to try his skills. Instead of doing something normal, he decided to summon a demon, thereby putting the entire city in danger. Apparently, this nugget found some mediocre ritual on the internet and decided that all his wishes would come true if he followed it. Therefore, the main character, without thinking twice, headed straight to the place from which the strange energy was emanating. He soon reached a house where the concentration of this energy was incredibly strong, and apparently the summoning took place right here. As soon as George reached the right place, he immediately hurried to take off his helmet. Serby noted that it was not too late to turn back, and the hero wanted to do so, but the demon could sense him or Serby and chase after the prey. However, his little animal was still convinced that George was simply overestimating himself. After that, they approached a house from the window of which an incredibly bright magical light was coming. The protagonist and Serby headed straight inside the building and began to climb the stairs. The higher they rose, the more distinct became the concentration of energy that the main character was chasing. Soon he reached the room where this very summoning was taking place, and George could feel what was happening inside this room. This whole ritual was incredibly vulgar. Apparently these people used candles for the summoning ritual, and perhaps even a robe on their body, smeared with chicken blood. Without thinking twice, the protagonist entered the apartment, while Serby remained waiting for him outside. But when George opened the door of the room and looked inside, what he saw truly horrified him. He saw that a magical seal was drawn in the middle of the room. There were candles all around, and in the middle of the seal lay a naked girl, and a fat man towered over her. When the hero took a closer look, he realized that the girl was tied with chains. She was wearing absolutely no clothes, and apparently she had lost consciousness. At first, George didn't know whether he should intervene, as everything looked very strange here, and he didn't understand why the girl was chained. However, one thing was clear to him. This guy was definitely an idiot. He continued to cast the spell, and at that moment the magic circle in which the girl lay began to glow more and more brightly, causing her to experience severe pain and scream. Suddenly, a demon-like man appeared next to the summoner, and George realized that he was interested in what the summoner wanted, and how he was going to pay for his desires, to which the fat man decided to use the girl, along with her body and energy, as payment. It was unbearably difficult for the main character to watch this, as the situation looked like a real disgrace. However, he realized that he could not leave it like that, and decided to intervene in this ritual. So he opened wide the door behind which he stood, and greeted the men inside with an unperturbed smile. The fat man was very surprised that someone had broken into his apartment, and George realized that he was trying to find out who he was. However, the demon standing nearby seemed to be very happy that the protagonist had come here. His eyes suddenly began to glow, and a wide smile appeared on his face. The protagonist calmly entered the room and announced that he had arrived from the Spatial Transition Control Service. At that moment, he held his hands behind his back and prepared a magical seal, and this did not hide from the eyes of the demon, who realized that in front of him stood both a summoner and a guardian. However, the protagonist calmly addressed them and informed them that they had violated the ban on the use of summoning dark entities. The fat man began to sharply turn his head from side to side, claiming that this was the first time he had heard of such prohibitions. But the hero continued to stand his ground, declaring that ignorance of the law was no excuse, and therefore demanded that the draft be cancelled, after which the proceedings would proceed according to the law. However, the fat man was not going to give up so easily and ordered the demon to first kill the guy and then fulfill his wish. At that moment, the main character looked at his pet, which was sitting nearby. However, he decided that it was not worth dragging him into all this, and so he decided to act himself, calling upon 2 magical seals. The fat man was very surprised that this stranger also turned out to be a magician, and so he abruptly ran towards the window. Before the demon could do anything, he was already held back by George's magical seals, preventing him from moving. And then the main character took out a small red magic crystal and squeezed it between his fingers. The demon realized that this guy was serious, so he tried to maintain a friendly attitude until the very end, and even wanted to negotiate with him. But George still stood his ground. He threw the magic stone, and it hit the demon right in the chest, taking away his energy, which he had been accumulating for hundreds of years. The stone suddenly began to glow, various symbols appeared on it, and in just a few moments it absorbed almost all of the demon's power. There was no trace left of the former attractive demon. Now he was completely exhausted and could not even stand on his feet. He still didn't understand what this stranger was doing to him, and he really hoped that he wouldn't bring him back. However, the protagonist firmly stated that he would simply kill him. The stranger began to scream and tried with all his might to cast a spell, but nothing worked, as George's magic had completely drained and sealed his abilities. After this, George turned to his pet Serby and said that he could now destroy the seal. Without further ado, the little animal came up and placed its paws on the seal, and gradually it began to disappear. Then George snapped his fingers, and in an instant, the chains that bound the girl lying in the center of the room snapped sharply, freeing her. She was now free, but still unconscious, and since she was naked, George decided to wrap her in a blanket. After that, he lifted the girl's body and carried her to the bed. When they laid her on the bed, Serby asked his owner what he was going to do with her, and even began to think that George was going to take her with him. However, the hero said that he had no time to mess around with the girl now, since she was not a trophy, and there was no point in taking her. But he was still glad that they had managed to interrupt the ritual at the very early stage. Otherwise, they would have had to face a more dangerous creature later. George had already been burned by this once, and he did not want to repeat the experience. Once that was done, he left the house and headed back to his motorcycle. After a while, he returned to his bar, and as soon as he walked inside, he immediately felt a pleasant feeling of finally being home. Michael and Natalie greeted him immediately, apparently managing to get the job done in George's absence. George immediately asked the man what had happened while he was gone, and Michael replied that several special clients had come in, and also noted that musicians had dropped in during that time. He then got out the forms for George and told him that the top 2 were really good, and that the fire department and the tax office had also come. Moreover, Michael was able to come up with some new drink and wanted to prepare it for the main character. But first he needed to calculate the proportions. George noted that when he hired Michael, he didn't even think that the guy would turn out to be such a treasure. He knew how to draw up documents, take care of the premises, and stir drinks beautifully, so he decided to give him a bonus this month. While Michael was pouring the drink, George asked him to make an order so they could have a tasting, since the key to a good party was music and cocktails, and Michael liked that theme too. The protagonist then told him that he would need to discuss something later, and that he would be upstairs if needed. George was very happy that he got a smart bartender, but he was a little indecisive and afraid of responsibility. If Michael had been bolder, he would have become an excellent event manager, and perhaps would have already opened his own agency. The idea of holding concerts in the bar was originally Michael's, but George wasn't thrilled with the idea at first. Parties are always noisy, someone always drinks too much, and then there are fights, scandals, and visits from the police, and the main character didn't like all of this. The bar became his new home, and he didn't want to let just anyone in there. He was thinking of making it a quiet place for negotiations and gatherings at the bar, but Michael still insisted on a stage. Ultimately, his idea led to people flocking to the bar, and now money was circulating in their establishment. All it took was a few right words and tips to the right people, and several bands were already off to conquer the capital. As a result, musicians in their city developed a saying that if you want to reach the sky, you just need to perform in a bar. At that moment, George was approached by his spiritual mentor, who scolded him for abandoning his training. He understood that George had a difficult path, but the school was not developing, and he was simply living his life peacefully. The protagonist also understood that his growing popularity was associated with an increase in the amount of work he had to deal with. However, when he studied the questionnaires, he realized that Michael had not deceived him. The first two candidates were really very good, and he decided to call them to invite them to perform. Eventually, his workday ended, and George couldn't help but note that it had gone quite well. He had managed to update contracts, negotiate with groups, and get the accounting done. He then noticed the calendar and decided that he should help Michael, as he was most likely already at the end of his strength. He turned to his pet Serby and said that he should now be in charge instead of him. It was now 9 p.m., the time of the protagonist's main clients. These were not vampires or werewolves at all, but ordinary people. So George went downstairs to greet his guests. It was no problem for him that they were a little on the wrong side of the law, since they knew exactly the real value of an honest word. His bar was inviolable and considered neutral territory. He then turned his attention to Michael, who was standing behind the bar, and noted that the guy was starting to show off again. With one deft movement, Michael tossed 3 bottles at once and mixed them into one cocktail. The main character could not understand at what point this guy became so gifted. He used incredible tricks to prepare cocktails for his customers, and everyone loved him for this. When George saw this, he understood why the fire department had come recently. He couldn't argue that it was beautiful, but cocktails wouldn't make themselves, so he decided to let Michael develop, as long as he knew his business. At that moment, a strong man entered the bar and greeted the owner. George noted that he was looking at him too intently, and did not understand why he needed to greet him personally. It all sounded like a gangster drama, but George didn't show it. Instead, he smiled broadly and informed the man that room number 3 was available for him. He also hoped that the man knew that this establishment had certain rules. In response, the man snatched the keys to the room and said that he had already been informed of these rules. As soon as he left, Michael leaned over to George and remarked that he didn't like this guy at all. But George said that he shouldn't like him, since he wasn't even a woman. But if a man was willing and able to pay, he was happy to provide him with services. He then asked Michael to stop talking nonsense, as he had a line of people waiting for drinks. It was another Friday night, and George was standing behind the bar again. He didn't mind, but this time he seemed to be stuck behind it. At this point, Christopher realized that he was going around in circles of endless paperwork, repetitive orders, and household chores, and now it seemed to him that it was time to change something. He remembered Aaron mentioning the Royal School of Art, and George decided to go there. It wasn't a bad idea, a new place where they use different methods of working with magic, as well as ancient auction houses. George was just thinking that if nothing changed, then nothing would change, when suddenly he was distracted by a signal coming from room number 3. He realized that something important was happening in this room, since signals were not sent just like that, and said that he would step away for now. George really wanted to spend this evening in peace. He believed that he deserved it after all his work, but fate decreed otherwise. The protagonist approached room number 3 with displeasure and asked the person inside what was happening there. However, without waiting for an answer, he went inside, and as soon as he opened the door, a pool of blood poured out at his feet. When George looked up, he saw the rude man, but his chest was cut open and his heart was lying right at his feet, and then George knew that they would have to close early today. A couple of years ago, he made an intriguing contact, a man he could call in a similar situation, and he has never had the good fortune to meet him in person. However, this was exactly the case, and this man turned out to be completely different from what George had imagined. A man in a red suit and hat arrived at the bar and said he was glad to meet George, despite all the circumstances. George asked him to introduce himself, but he said that he could just call him Hatter, and if George was uncomfortable with that, he could address him as Ivan. Since they had already finished exchanging pleasantries, the Hatter decided to ask the protagonist what special thing had happened that night. George explained that, unfortunately, he had no choice but to call the man into the bar, and then explained in detail what had happened. The Hatter noted that it would be wrong to resolve such an incident without George's participation, but the event that had occurred greatly interested him. Soon after, they went to room number 3, and the Hatter examined the man's corpse, noting that it all looked very interesting indeed. He pointed to the man's exposed chest, as he realized someone had torn out his heart. George explained that he was simply providing a service to ensure a fair deal, but that there was never any talk of protecting clients from each other. In response, the Hatter just smiled broadly and said that it was a very good idea of George to call him. If he had acted alone, he might have been in huge trouble. He explained that this man was the former head of a punitive detachment of a respected person, and therefore the Hatter did not even see the need to explain the full seriousness of the situation. At that moment, the main character felt that right now, he was getting into some kind of trouble. The Hatter said that he would immediately settle this unpleasant incident, and asked George if he had hidden cameras or wiretaps in his offices. He added that if this was really the case, then George should not be embarrassed and should better confess, since this would be a big plus and would remove unnecessary suspicion from him. Then George admitted that they had a camera, but it was only aimed at the entrance to the bar, and then asked what to do with the body. As it turned out, the Hatter had already called the people, so there would be no body and no rumors either. He acted as if nothing had happened in that place. Then George asked, a little wearily, how often things like this happened that didn't actually happen. George thought about the fact that he had owned this bar for several years now, and all sorts of things had happened here. Fights, jealousy scenes, bottleneck duels, and even shootings. But it had never come to murder. But now he was worried about who had done it, and for what purpose. He had few ill-wishers, none of them would dare to enter the bar, and it was pointless to do it alone. His own people would not forgive him, and others were more dangerous. He didn't think that anyone would want to oppose the true rulers of this city. George was afraid to imagine what other people served them. To do such a thing, one would have to be under the protection of the imperial family. Or maybe a demon had simply broken into the bar. But that was unlikely. In all the years of hunting, not a single one had ever come here. All the rods were covered by accounts, and finding them without signing a contract with George was problematic, but still possible. However, the main character was already tired of guessing, and he decided to find out who it really was. The thing is, he wasn't completely open with the Hatter. In fact, he really didn't have wiretaps or cameras, because he had no need for them. No one guessed that the main character was using spirits, which had a number of advantages, and did not require any cameras. So as soon as the Hatter had gone, George called upon one of the spirits, and a small spirit in the form of a squirrel appeared before him. Soon, a picture of what actually happened appeared before George. He saw two figures, one of which was imbued with demonic energy. This was quite interesting. Now it became clear to George that someone connected with demons was involved in this after all. At that moment, Serby looked into the room, who was very glad that the Hatter had finally left. Serby asked the owner to tell him what had happened, but George hoped that he could clarify the situation himself. Serby looked around the room carefully and said that he could smell blood and a demon. Perhaps another psycho decided to summon a demon and leave it here for the rest of his days. However, after sniffing more closely, he added that it was not a demon, but something else. Very similar. The so-called possessed. George thought all this time that it was fiction, but Serby said that he was absolutely serious. These were rare demons, but they still existed. The main character was very unhappy. He did not understand why he was constantly attracting all sorts of evil spirits to himself. Serby revealed that he has been in contact with the energy of another world for a long time, and has created his bar as an ideal home for demons and other dark entities, so it is not surprising that it attracts them. It's a good thing George at least had the foresight to shield his rods. Otherwise his bar would have become a feeding ground for the entire city. However, the hero no longer needed further explanations, and asked his pet what he should do next with this possessed one. Serby said he had two options. Either the possessed would never come again, or he would become a regular guest, and then another serial killer would appear in the city. The next day, the possessed did not show up, so George calmly went about his business. To his disappointment, Serby was right. Despite the protection of the anchors around the bar, the magical background was increased. The worst thing about this situation was that George didn't feel his presence. After all, self-education is a tricky thing, and yet he doesn't know that much. Now he had no idea at all how to prevent the visits, and if the murder continued, rumors would spread. A bad reputation is a good thing, of course, but not in his case. And as luck would have it, there were no orders related to sudden murders right now. The possessed seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The likelihood that he had fallen into the hands of the Hatter was extremely small, and everything seemed fine and calm. But George had a bad feeling. Plus, with the inspections, he had more paperwork, and the idea of updates no longer seemed like a joke. Michael stubbornly pretended that she didn't understand anything about running a bar, and so George had to look for someone on the side. But even that created a small problem. All the people suitable for this vacancy mostly had some kind of flaw, and the main character did not want to let rats into his home at all. However, he did come across one candidate. Her name was Helga, and she claimed that repeating the same thing over and over again in the hope of a different result was not madness at all, but stubbornness. And so he decided to see what she would be like in reality. As George had expected, Helga quickly responded to his proposal, and they surprisingly quickly found common ground. At first, he offered her to work 6 days a week. But then the schedule changed. She would work 40 hours a week, with each additional hour paid at time and a half. Their agreement was only a matter of time, but he had no idea that he had let a monster get close to him. Soon, Helga declared that she couldn't even imagine why their establishment still existed. She had never seen such chaotic accounting. Not a single month simply added up. There were too many loopholes in the documents, and she was sure that they would not survive any inspection. But George claimed that previously no inspections had come to him at all. Helga said she didn't know what business George was running and she didn't care. But he was the one who hired her as manager, and now she was the one responsible for the establishment and its paperwork. She decided to be honest, and stated that before this, the accounting department here had been handled by a real amateur. But she gave George her word that in a week, even the emperor himself would not be able to get into their papers. In some ways, Helga was right. George had never learned how to run a business like this. He received the building as payment for a service. The bar already existed at the time, and he decided to keep it, just slightly remodeling it to suit his own needs. In general, he thought that the bar would be a good help in legitimizing his income from various orders. Then the idea came up to create small meeting rooms, and later he moved here himself, after which he hired Michael and the others. No matter what income the bar brought in, George continued to occasionally take orders from outside. It might seem like he was spreading himself thin, but that was not the case at all. Over the years, he developed a certain reputation, and he was forced to maintain it. He never thought that their city's fort would be so popular. But in general, he was currently suffering from a lack of funds, and all tasks could be seen as potential sources of income. In the end, he found a suitable option for himself, since simply getting paid by 3 famous families for one case was pleasant. In the end, he said goodbye to Helga and apologized for leaving so suddenly. Moreover, he didn't like checking all this accounting at all, so he, roughly speaking, simply ran away. Soon, the main character arrived at the right place where he was supposed to meet with the clients. There, a large man approached him and asked George to come with him, as he was already expected. The thing is that recently people started disappearing in the port. At first they were ordinary people, but then servants of large cities started disappearing, and understandably, they started keeping an eye on these disappearances. He soon met a man who thanked him for responding to their request and asked him to follow him to the scene of the latest incident. He also explained the details of the case. It all started about a month and a half ago. First, several workers, not belonging to any clan, disappeared. At first, no one paid any attention to it. People just disappear somewhere all the time. But then things got strange. People started to just disappear, as if they had never been there. The missing people were not any special people. They were ordinary port workers, loaders, forwarders, and logisticians. All ordinary people from families of hereditary servants. This case was very important and urgent, so they turned to George. George guessed that the owners of these people had already conducted more than one investigation, and of course they had reached a dead end. So he asked if he was sure that there were no connections between the missing people. The man said that there was nothing special. They were different people of different ages, but they disappeared absolutely suddenly. Some eyewitnesses said that their interlocutors disappeared into thin air as soon as they turned away. George asked how many people had disappeared in total. But he understood that in reality, he was not a detective. His summoned creatures did everything for him, and these questions were only needed to maintain the image. The blonde said that the last disappearance happened yesterday at this place, and then the main character asked to leave him alone for a while. After that, he headed to the place where the last disappearance supposedly took place. It was cordoned off with police tape. But this did not stop George. He sighed and began his investigation. The first thing he noticed was that the water was still warm, although the bay was cold. Then he suddenly looked up and saw a purple cap lying nearby. At that moment, that stole actually decided to leave him alone and went off somewhere in the opposite direction. The protagonist was very happy about this, because now he could stop acting as if he really was a detective. Now he used his magic to explore this place with the help of summoned creatures. But to his surprise, this time he summoned a cat, and since he had no choice, he asked the creature to find the culprit of all this. The cat obeyed. First he stretched like a normal animal and then got down to business. First of all, he turned his gaze to the cap and sniffed it carefully. Then he sniffed the strange lump of water, which, unlike all the other water, was warm. Then the cat suddenly jumped sharply and ran somewhere in an unknown direction. He was so fast that George could not keep up with him. He had to try hard to catch up with the creature, which was jumping from one container to another at great speed. Eventually the cat landed in one place, and then suddenly arched his back and began to hiss. It was then that George realized that this was the very place where another murder had taken place. When he looked down at his feet, he noticed with horror that he was standing right in a huge pool of someone's blood. It seemed to him as if death was following him closely, and there was a strange feeling emanating from this place. He assumed that some kind of monster, or even worse, a demon, had settled here. So George decided to play it safe and called the port director. He greeted the man and said that he had not very good news. Apparently, he would need some time to solve this problem. In the end, he was given 30 hours to solve this problem, which was very generous on the part of the port director. George didn't know who or what would be here, so he decided to play it safe, summoned a lot of magical seals, and now he only had one piece left. He took out a knife and cut his palm. His blood was needed to complete the ritual, as well as the recitation of some spells. Once everything was ready, he clenched his fist tightly and dropped blood directly onto the spot where the summoning was to take place. The fact is that the blood seal was unique in its kind. It was capable of luring any killer, even a sentient one. Absolutely any creature with a thirst for blood will sooner or later be unable to resist the call and will eventually come here. When the protagonist saw the seal beneath his feet begin to activate and glow brightly, he realized that he was actually ready for battle. Moreover, he understood that there would be no fight at all, which is why he was so calm. If everything worked as it should, the killer would be instantly immobilized. But if this did not happen, he still had a plan. So now he had no choice but to wait until the monster smelled his blood. After a while, George felt the seals begin to vibrate and realized that the killer had finally arrived. He saw a dark silhouette that was clearly unhappy with being summoned, and it turned out that this monster was Triton. He didn't understand why some mortal was bothering him, to which the protagonist explained that Triton had become a problem and needed to be removed. The monster itself was clearly not thrilled with this explanation, so it leaped with all its might towards George and landed right in the center of the seal. He was apparently not at all afraid, as he was confident that no mortal could do anything to him, since he was a descendant of the gods. Everything went exactly according to the protagonist's plan. As soon as Triton found himself in the center of the seal, he immediately clenched his fist, activating the magical circuits. In an instant, Triton found himself bound hand and foot, and despite all his threats, he could not break free from the magical shackles. George noted that it was very sad that the monster was so aggressive. You see, the collector could pay him dearly for a living relic. However, the black market wouldn't mind getting something like this either. And plus, this monster would be much easier to transport in parts. Triton struggled to break free from his bonds, and did not understand who this mortal really was who was able to stop him. But George said that was the wrong question. He should have asked how much his body would be worth on the black market. Soon after, he cut off the monster's head. In fact, George had not planned to meet a creature like Triton, so he was not prepared. And now he had to transport his body in parts, since he could not even imagine that such muck could be found in the bay. Moreover, the main character was sure that this was not someone's failed call. He would have felt it, just like he did with that apartment. He was still wondering where this strange Triton had come from. But that was no longer important now. Eventually, this monster will become a new item on the black market. The thing is that the main character already had a rather long-standing friendship with the black market. For them, he was something like a supplier of rarities, several years of close work, a certain amount of trust, and now he was receiving the warmest welcome. Moreover, traditions were highly valued here. But that was another story. He never understood why these aristocrats needed to hide the identity of their clients behind a mask in the age of surveillance cameras and fingerprint scanners. Soon, George arrived at the office of the black market boss, and they decided to get straight to business. The man asked if he would like to use the services of an appraiser. The hero agreed, and then the blonde man asked if he wanted to look at their goods, and without hesitation the protagonist agreed. He was amazed at how they combined tradition and modern trends, but then he turned his attention to the products, and decided to look at the precious stones first. At that moment, a man with a monocle entered the office and asked the blonde and George what interesting thing they had brought today. The man also pointed to a large purple container that stood in the middle of the room. George added that about an hour had passed since the monster's death. When the man took out Triton's hand, he could not determine what kind of creature this was. It had scales, and by its smell it was something that lived in water, but had the ability to use tools. When he decided to ask the miner himself what kind of creature it was, the protagonist assumed that it was Triton. In the end, this monster was valued at least 400,000, and George exchanged this money for a decent amount of precious stones, some materials, and 4 extremely rare books on ritual magic. According to the old tradition, the order was supposed to be placed in a safe deposit box, along with the remainder of the Triton sale. So he was given the key to the box, along with the necessary address. The sum turned out to be quite decent, more than $500,000, but George still had unfinished business. He summed up that he had completed 3 orders for several hundred thousand and $500,000 on top, and from this realization even the air seemed to become fresher. After this, he went to the port and told the worker that he could now declare that it was safe here. However, there was one question: what would happen to the missing people? And George replied that a team of scuba divers would easily find the remains in nearby waters. Finally, he gave the man some friendly advice. He needed to start looking for a good cleaning service now. Soon the main character finally returned to himself. If you think about it, he hadn't really slept for 3 days, but it was worth it. He decided that now was the time to just lie down and get a good night's sleep. But when he went into his office, he saw Helga sitting there, who, apparently, was clearly unhappy that George had disappeared somewhere for so long. When the hero saw her at the table, he was very scared, and also reminded her to simply call him by his name when there were no guests. But Helga said that he was her boss anyway, but George insisted, saying that he ordered to call him by his first name. At that moment, the woman suddenly raised her voice and said that they needed to clarify a few things. The hero plopped down on the sofa and asked her to do it quickly. Then the girl said that there were a lot of questions, but the most important one was how this bar even exists. Newbies don't care, but if you take a closer look, it becomes clear that the establishment is unprofitable. So she had a question, which was what is the main source of income for this enterprise? However, the hero explained that this did not concern her. But Helga was not talking about this. She needed to understand what amount to count on when planning development. The sum of about 10,000 a month turned out to be enough for her. And then she asked the hero what he thought about remodeling the bar. George clearly didn't like this idea. He said that they wouldn't change the concept of the bar, and the rest wasn't that important, like chairs or tables. Helga also suggested reworking the menu. It wasn't necessary to create something heavy. You could simply add a few appetizers, salads, and less complex dishes, and not give out the menu until the customer orders alcohol. She eventually managed to persuade George, and he asked her to prepare several menu options and bring them for consideration. As it turned out, Helga had already prepared menu options. Apparently, she knew in advance that the boss would agree. The girl did not answer this question directly, and said that she would not bother him anymore, after which she wished George a good rest. At some point, the hero began to doubt that she was even human. Perhaps she was some kind of higher demon, and he decided to test her someday. After a couple of days, everything was fine. Under Helga's pressure, he chose the menu, and he also chose several projects for redesigning the bar. So now the girl was harmless and busy with work for a couple of months. The protagonist himself delved into the research and asked Serby if a demon could enter the human world without using a contract. The animal didn't want to give a direct answer to this question, and then the main character began to threaten him that he would cut the budget for his feeding. This was the last straw for Serby, and then he finally agreed to answer. In general, they tried not to talk about it, so George owed him some kind of favor. Breaking into this world was possible if one accumulated enough energy. Some strong spirits or demons were able to do this with their willpower. However, the chance of failure was very high, and no one really knew how exactly it worked. If the transition is unsuccessful, the demon loses all the accumulated energy, and there is not much of it in the human world, but some are lucky and break through. The demon can also return back, of course, if he himself wishes so. Now it became clear to George how Triton had appeared there, and then Serby asked him who Triton was and where he had found him. At first, the hero also didn't want to answer directly, but he still told that he received one order, and it was that very Triton. When Serby asked what he did with his body, the protagonist, without further ado, replied that he simply chopped it into pieces and sold it on the black market. For Serby, this was a real waste, because if Triton really did come here through the breach, George could eat him and gain Triton's power. But the main character was disgusted even to hear about it. He definitely didn't want to eat any disgusting stuff like this guy. Serby explained that many demon hunters did just that, and then said that if George was finished, he would go. But George stopped him, asking the little animal what the likelihood was that such creatures would penetrate them. Serby explained that the probability was minimal. He had a better chance of running into a vacant conscript than such a free-spirited reveler. At that moment, there was suddenly a knock on the main character's office. As it turned out, it was Michael. He said that some girl was downstairs asking for James. He had already tried to throw her out, but she did not leave. Moreover, she looked as if she had come here on foot from the capital itself. The main character couldn't even guess who it could be, but he still decided to go down. Perhaps it was a dissatisfied client, or the wife of the murdered bandit. However, he noticed that the security system did not react in any way, which meant that it was definitely a person. When the hero went downstairs, he saw a girl who was behaving very aggressively. She demanded to be allowed to meet George. At that moment, she suddenly noticed a man coming down the stairs and looked up sharply. As soon as she realized that she had finally found the right person, she calmed down and immediately smiled. When George saw her, he immediately realized that this was the same girl he saved in that apartment. But he did not understand how she found him. Before his eyes, he still had the image of her lying in the center of the magical seal, bound hand and foot, completely naked. But he still decided to leave these thoughts for later and focus on why this girl came here. He greeted her and said that he was glad to see such a charming guest, noting that they had already met once, but he did not remember her name. At this point, the girl became a little thoughtful. Apparently, she either didn't remember her name or didn't want to say it. And then her gaze fell on a newspaper where the name of a famous woman was written in large print. Therefore, she could not think of anything better to do than to call herself by this name, declaring that her name was Lena. George noted that she was quite resourceful and quick-witted, but he was no fool either. But he played along and said that her name was very beautiful. In response, the girl smiled broadly and suddenly began talking about the events that took place in that apartment. But George interrupted her, called Michael and Natalie over, and asked them to brew some milk oolong tea, and also make a couple of sandwiches for them. After that, he turned to Lena and asked her to go to the 3rd floor. Now he had to find out who this mysterious woman really was. When Lena opened her eyes, she was overcome with cold and horror. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to find herself in an unfamiliar place and not understand anything. She didn't know where she was, and what's more, she didn't remember who she was. The only thing she knew for sure was that something terrible had happened to her, but she didn't know what exactly. Pain pierced her head every now and then, preventing her from thinking normally. All her instincts screamed that she couldn't stay in this place. As a result, the girl looked around and found some kind of bag with clothes in the room. To her great surprise, the clothes were her size, so without thinking twice, she put them on anyway. Moreover, in this package she found someone's bag and decided to rummage through it. What was surprising was that she found a wallet there with some money in it. When the girl was ready, she went outside and immediately felt something strange, as if hundreds of small needles were simultaneously piercing her body, and vague images began to appear in her head. At that moment she realized that she just needed to be here. And then she felt an amazing lightness and incredible strength. But the strangest thing was that she knew exactly where she needed to go. The girl tried to catch hitchhikers who could take her to the right place, but the price for their services was disgusting to her, so she had no choice but to go on her own. As a result, she walked completely alone through the forest to the place where her own brain called her. She almost did not feel tired or hungry. While walking through the forest, she tore all her clothes, and there were numerous wounds on her body. But she did not care what other people thought of her. The closer she got to her goal, the more confidence she felt within herself. She saw many wonderful things on the way here. However, among what she encountered, there were also some not-so-pleasant things. For the last 2 days she simply could not sleep from anticipation. She walked and walked forward to the place she needed. After some time, the girl finally reached the city. And now she could literally feel with her skin how close she was to her goal. The closer she got, the more clearly she understood where she was going and why. And after some time, she arrived at the very bar where she was currently located. That was her story. And now Lena was sitting in the main character's office. Then George asked her how she knew his name. Lena replied that when she was standing in front of the bar, the name George popped into her head. However, now she didn't know what to do next. Moreover, she said that she found the wallet in her bag, but now she lost it. George was completely confused. He didn't know what to do with this girl. He suddenly assumed that she was most likely tired. So he gave her the key, saying that there was a guest room on the second floor where she could properly rest, sleep, and wash. But to his surprise, the girl did not accept the key. She stated that she was not tired at all. Even though her stomach was growling, she didn't feel hungry. But George still asked her to take a shower, change clothes, and rest, and that they would discuss everything in the evening. He also said that she could contact Natalie or Helga with any questions, thus giving Lena consent to stay here. When the girl heard this, she was overjoyed. She immediately snatched the key from the protagonist's hands and ran away. She slammed the door so hard that a potted flower standing nearby simply fell to the floor. George noted that it was a very interesting story, but he did not understand why this girl found him. And her story was strange. Apparently she knew where to go, but he had never heard of anything like this. In the end, he spent the whole day searching, but didn't find a single mention of what Lena was talking about. A couple of times he thought about turning to the internet, but quickly dismissed that thought. Firstly, no one is responsible for the quality of the information published. And secondly, any grain of truth is actively mixed with a bucket of lies. At some point, Serby burst into his room and was clearly unhappy that George was sitting with his books again. The boy explained that this was just one way of transmitting information and asked the animal what it wanted. Serby said that they would learn everything they needed to know just by living an extra day, a philosophical thought that was completely alien to him. Then the hero asked him if he had ever heard of a connection being established between two beings, with the help of which one of them could find the other even many kilometers away. And at that moment, Serby's eyes flashed with an unkind gleam. He said that there was definitely such a connection between them. However, Serby still didn't understand why it was necessary to read books for this. In his opinion, people were complete idiots. And at that moment the main character realized that he was a real idiot. Serby didn't even deny it. George immediately jumped up from his seat and ordered Serby to stay there and not go anywhere. He needed him to look at something. After that, he headed towards the exit of the room and once again asked the pet to stay here. Soon after, he brought Lena into his room and said that he needed to check something. However, when the girl saw Serby, she immediately screamed in horror and hid behind George, who assumed that she was afraid of dogs. However, the girl said that it was not a dog at all, but something else, something more dangerous. When Serby heard this, he became truly angry, and his true wolf nature was awakened. He said that it was very impudent of her to call him that. George was very unhappy that Serby had disobeyed him and spoken. But the pet no longer saw the point in remaining silent, since Lena realized that he was not a dog at all. Moreover, he felt that the two were connected. This connection was similar to the one between them, but in some ways it was different. George then asked him to be kind and tell him what this connection was that he was talking about. Serby explained that if he was not mistaken, then this connection was teacher-student, although he was not strong in such matters and could be mistaken. Then George asked him where this connection could have come from, since he had only seen Lena once, and even then only briefly. Lena immediately grabbed his hand and asked if he really saw her. But Serby didn't let her finish, and said that it looked like a parting gift from the incubus. The fact is that George interfered with the ritual, and unwittingly became a participant in the summoning, so the incubus received limited power over him, since George humiliated him, and he decided to take revenge on him in this way. The connection was simple enough. Perhaps he lacked the strength or imagination, but George should have been glad that in this connection he was the teacher. It could have worked the other way around. But since he was magically stronger, he was the one who became the teacher. However, Lena still didn't understand what was happening and asked someone to finally explain everything to her. But George said that he himself did not fully understand everything. He was traveling from the capital to his city and decided to diversify the route a little. When he passed one place, he noticed a strange energy. Someone was doing a summoning there. For a number of reasons, he decided not to take any risks and went to nip any problems in the bud, which is where he met Lena. She was a victim for the draft. When it was all over, he left her and she went back to her city. He knew it sounded bad, but taking her unconscious somewhere, especially on a motorcycle, would be dangerous. Moreover, he didn't know where to put her, and Lena was fine, and in the end she even made it to the city on foot. Moreover, George asked her not to worry and promised that he would definitely remove this connection. But to his surprise, the girl asked him not to do it. The hero assured her that he would be able to find her relatives, and then they would return her home and her memories. But Lena flatly refused this. She said that she didn't want to go back, since this had happened to her. No one was really looking for her, and judging by his words, she should have died. But he saved her. Lena decided that the old her had died, but now the new her was here. Serby supported her, saying that it was stupid to refuse a student with a dark gift like his, especially when she herself came to him. At this moment, the main character was in real horror. He wanted to scream from this whole incomprehensible situation. He didn't understand what Serby meant when he said that she had the same dark gift. He asked him to stop speaking in riddles. It was difficult for the pet to explain it, but he said that it was similar to the sensation of smell. Moreover, Lena and George smelled very similar. But again, this only speaks of similarity. At that moment, George truly regretted interfering with that activated ritual, and now having to deal with all the consequences. He also understood that leaving Lena here was dangerous. No one knew what was embedded in this connection, but he couldn't let her go, because of that same connection. If she did something, then the others would easily come straight to him. Therefore, he finally made a decision and allowed the girl to become his student. He said her first rule would be that she wouldn't tell anyone that Serby could talk. He explained that he didn't usually behave like this, but today he was probably bitten by fleas. But Serby resolutely denied that he had any illnesses. Anything that tried to taste his blood instantly burned up. Thus, our protagonist's peaceful days ended. But sometimes fate gives people chances. Even in his spam folder he found something interesting. And then George thought that he had always been quite lucky. He felt like these people on the internet were specifically spying on him. And he couldn't resist, and ended up buying the books they offered him. There he learned that the teacher-student relationship was not such a rarity in their world, and had long been used in noble families. This was mainly done for training purposes. With the help of this magic, many things became a little easier. The mentor could explain not only with words, but also through communication, convey a drop of his experience to his student. However, this relationship also had another side, much more unpleasant. The student became weak-willed and obedient. In some cases, the student even became obsessed, following his mentor completely, ignoring his own desires. George realized that this was indeed similar to Lena's case. She had walked to his city, and now he was even interested in where she had come from so that he could look at the distance she had managed to cover. But unfortunately, Lena did not remember her city. Moreover, sometimes students would do absolutely anything for the sake of their teacher. Some even sacrificed their lives for the sake of their mentor. However, there was a plus to this, in which case their connection was broken. However, there was another way to break the connection: simply finish your studies. And then George remembered that Serby had mentioned something about a similar dark gift. And so he decided that in that case, he needed to start training Lena right now, which is what he was going to do. And what would come of it, we would find out later.